Welcome to the Ideation Podcast. This is an on-the-go podcast designed to help you move your ideas forward through better implementation. In each episode, we'll hear from thought leaders in multiple industries, share about how they implement their ideas in order to make them remarkable. That is worth making a remark about. I'm your host, Charles Lee. Hey everyone, thanks again for joining us for the Ideation Podcast. This is Charles Lee again, and I am really super excited to interview our guest today. She's been a friend for a few years now. Her name is Jamie Gutfreund. In a moment, you'll get to hear her thoughts and her insights and her story. She is an accomplished executive with significant experience building teams, creating new products, and delivering results. Jamie's current activities include her role as a board member for Tubular Labs, the leading measurement and analytics solution for social video, as a strategic advisor for Kidtech startup, SuperAwesome, and programmatic in-game platform Onzo. Previously, she served as a chief consumer experience officer for Hasbro, where she implemented the first programmatic media campaign, established an internal creative and analytics agency, and supported the growth and expansion of Pulse, a direct-to-consumer commerce effort. Also, Jamie previously served as Global Chief Marketing Officer at WPP's Wunderman Thompson, with a specific focus on highlighting the work of the agency's 20,000 plus creative thinkers, data scientists, and technologists across the globe. She lives in Los Angeles with her family and 2 dogs and remains a dedicated fan of the New York Giants. Well, I got to start there. How did you become a fan of the New York Giants? Thanks so much for joining us, Jamie.
Thank you for having me. It's so funny listening to that whole thing. And when I listen to it, I go, yes, I'm very proud of my fandom for the New York Giants. Well, I lived in New York for a long time, but I married a diehard fan. So it was part of the package. And I have taken that responsibility to heart and lived through the good and the not so good. So yes, like many New York Giants fans, I am dedicated.
So did you have to assign a waiver or before you got married? He said, "I will not marry you unless you're a Giants fan."
Well, it was just sort of, this is how we roll. I mean, it extends to it's all New York sports teams. So it's Knicks, Giants, Yankees,
I love it.
Rangers. We had a whole thing going, and I think it's just a matter of this is what we do as a family, and I got into it. I grew up as a sports fan, so it wasn't that big of a leap, and I did start dating my then boyfriend, now husband, at a time when the Giants were winning Super Bowls, and so it was a little bit easier. But you've got to you've got to be able to show your pride even in the down years. So, but like everybody else right now, I would just be excited to have any kind of sport.
Absolutely.
So I don't know about you, but if you're a sports fan, did you watch the golf match this weekend with Eli and Tom Brady? I mean, with Peyton and Tom Brady, that was fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, Brady made an incredible shot. I loved all the trash talking back and forth. It's going to be weird to see Brady in a Bucs uniform this year, but being a lifelong Yankees fan, I grew up in New York, and so I've been a diehard Yankees fan since I can remember, and so I don't feel bad for Brady.
I love it. And the between Eli tweeting and the pants splitting, it was really entertaining, for sure.
Well, I so appreciate you taking a time, because I couldn't think of a better person, because I do want to talk about several topics today that I think our listeners will find super interesting and insightful. They range from everything that's happening in digital, data-driven marketing, to gaming, to what Gen Z means for brands, so there's so many things I can talk to you about. So I'm just going to dive right in, and almost like in rapid fire type of fashion. I'd love for you to take the conversation wherever you want to take us today. Does that sound good?
Sounds fantastic, and thank you.
Great. Well, I know, Jamie, you've worked in with leading. You have so much experience leading digital efforts for so many recognizable agencies and brands. So when you think about what you've seen, and I know everyone says technology is going at the speed of light, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. Over say the last 10 years, when you think about digital efforts for brands, Like, what are some things that have like surprised you the most and why? And maybe what are some things that you've been impressed by on what we've been able to create in this short span of time?
Well, it's an interesting thing. The word digital is always such a fascinating term, and I
Hmm.
think I'm a big fan of Professor Scott Galloway, and he always talks
Yeah.
about the great unlock. And what he was talking about recently is the fact in the last 2 decades, business has really benefited from where you could digitize what was analog to digital. Like that was
Hmm.
where companies made their money, and now we're seeing a shift in a lot of ways to go back. Like anybody that can go from from digital to analog, like sports, kind of
Yeah.
using that as a theme, is going to be really valuable. But I think the word digital now is sort of all encompassing, and I think it just means everything. So where I tend to think about it is instead of talking about sort of digital as a separate function, it's
Hmm.
really more about personalization and
Yeah.
making it matter to me. And that's where it starts to get interesting from a consumer perspective, and whether that's B2B or B2C, the idea of I as an individual, whether I'm buying software or I'm buying shoes, how well does this company know me, and how well are they going to service my needs and make the whole experience efficient and entertaining and easy from end to end. And I think that's the role of digital, uh, is really about the ability to deliver a personalized experience. I mean, yeah, you get it on your phone, that's mobile, you get wherever it is. But I think the idea is that it's everybody has to think about digital. It's not really its own entity anymore.
Yeah.
So that like when you look at it and you reframe the question that way, now where is that, where does that lead? And then what is an interesting question to ask if you think everything is digital and it's about personalization? Then you go from there.
I love it. So I love that shift because like, even like years ago when people were talking about like innovation, companies were creating specific departments or individuals who carry that role. And now it's this fuller embrace that's really a part of our culture and our values and our priorities and such. And it's basically integrated into most things. So when you think about this, because I feel like it can feel a little bit overwhelming depending on which industry you're in tackling some of these challenges. When you work with your clients, what are some top of mind things they're thinking about that they're trying to solve for, that you've been able to help them think through? Because it's, yeah, a shift into everything in many ways. And as they're doing that, I would assume like, there may be larger budgets and larger companies that can mobilize through staffing, but you've probably also seen like small businesses really embracing this. So what are some of the common challenges you see coming up today as people think about their future?
Great question. One of the things that always strikes me, big or small in a company, is the internal structure of a company and how that can always indicate whether a company will be successful or not and what their version of transformation might be.
Mm.
And the reason that is because companies grew up in departmental sort of constructs, right? It was a very uh, pyramid shaped, top down, hierarchical structure, whether you have a company of 50 people or a company of 50,000 people. It's a triangle shape, and that's very, industrial revolution. There's the CEO and then on down. But the world doesn't work that way. We're in a much more of an integrated environment. And so companies that are still in a rigid, siloed structure, whether they realize it or not, many don't realize it, those are the companies that are going to have the most challenge
Mm.
in terms of, quote unquote, either innovating or being able to adapt to new business models.
Right.
People experience organizations, they experience them vertically, but they're set up horizontally. No, the
Mm.
other way around. They experience them horizontally,
Right.
but they're set up vertically.
Yeah.
And whenever I've dealt with a client, you look at that as a first stop, and that will tell you where the work has to begin. And that's that's kind of a challenge, because if the departments are all functioning on their own without any integration, you're going to have a really hard time. So that's one big area that people should look at, is the structure of their organization. Another really important component of that is this idea of clarity. What is it that we're all trying to achieve? The typical quote unquote transformation usually happens through the CIO or the CTO, and it's a B2B driven endeavor. And you probably see this with innovation, where an outside partner will come in and they'll say, we need to raise our stock price. We need to be more modern. Let's innovate. Okay, great. We're going to bring in a tech partner, and we're going to come up with great ideas for automation. We're going to have just-in-time, resources. They're going to do all kinds of fantastic things. We're going to have data-driven marketing. We're going to have one-to-one experiences, and all of those things happen. And so it becomes a CTO-driven or CIO-driven endeavor. And the other rule of thumb that when I've had successful experiences is that you actually have to start with the human being. Like, what do you want to have happen? The clarity of what do you want the experience for your end user to be? Then you bring in the technology piece. Usually it's the other way around.
Yeah.
And that's where I think people get into a lot of trouble, because there's been a lot of situations where people have invested millions of dollars, and it's not the fault of the partner per se. It's just, it becomes its own animal. It's like, okay, great, we're going to have a relationship with this fantastic, technology partner, and they're designed to sell their solutions. But it's the company's responsibility to know what is going to be the best experience for the end user. And that is where I think a lot of people get tripped up. So clarity, making sure that your organization is communicating and thinking about the human aspect of it, not the tech aspect of it first.
I think that's great advice. I mean, it feels so common sense that you would start with some type of human-centric type of design solution. But I mean, I could understandably so in that environment, when you're kind of going, it feels as if taking that space to think about it from that perspective could either be cumbersome, or it feels like it may not be impactful. So what I'm hearing from you is like, I mean, at the end of the day, we're probably serving human beings generally for a lot of the products and services. It might be good to consider the human being.
It's the least expensive option. I've always been, one of the things that I'm always astounded about is when you enter into a relationship with a company and you ask them if their own employees have done their own sort of secret shopper. Have you gone onto your apps? Have you gone onto your own website? Have you really pretended to be a shopper or a consumer of your goods or services, and felt what that experience is like, good and bad? And these are some simple things that everybody should do before they're embarking on any kind of a major transformation effort. It just makes the most sense. And you find things that are really, I don't want to say simple to fix, but they're not necessarily, they don't require millions of dollars of an investment. And I think in this environment right now, being people smart is super important. One of the things I love, for example, that we're seeing in this time of such disruption is, obviously people are talking about the acceleration of all these behaviors. It's bringing to the forefront challenges that have been lingering, but now they're just magnified. One of my biggest pet peeves that we're all experiencing, being stuck in our homes, that I hope companies and organizations are taking a look at, is the concentration and the cumulative impact of CX, bad CX, bad consumer experiences.
Yeah.
So we're all home. We're all trying to deal with everything going digital in a very short period of time.
Yeah.
And by the end of the day, you can be exhausted. It's not logical. A lot of the UX
Right.
experience is designed by an engineer.
Right.
Some people are not as digitally savvy as others, and some of these things are not hard to fix,
Right.
but they take thoughtfulness, and they take thinking about the consumer first before you go on your tech roadmap. And we're all seeing it every day. And just think about your own experiences these days. At the end of the day, you're like, oh my God, I can't, this is just killing me. And you're seeing a lot of that right now. So I'm hoping that the concentration of those experiences will encourage a better sensitivity to the human experience.
I love it. I mean, I saw that. And it's not just that you're creating an experience that everyone can intuitively understand. I guess some of that depends on your audience. I remember when Snapchat came out first, like our kids had no problem navigating the functionality, but people who were not all, but generally older and were used to things like Facebook had an incredibly difficult time figuring out like, what am I doing here? Where are the buttons? Where are the labels? And I think it's kind of interesting because I know they were targeting younger so that they got it to a place where, a specific segment of the population can intuitively know it given their realm of experience. And yet another part of the market would have some barriers to entry.
Exactly. Well, here's an anecdote that I can't say the name of the company, but a former client was in the telecom industry, and we did a very in-depth project for them. And it started with when the company would drop off or your box would get delivered to hook up your cable and all of your internet and everything. We put sensors on people to measure their heart rate, their perspiration, and we watched them step by step opening up the box. I mean, there's nothing worse than having to put together something that's highly technical in your cable system and your computer system and your internet system. It's like the worst. And this was about 5 years ago. And the spike in blood pressure and perspiration was equal to that of somebody being in a car accident.
Wow.
Or like being in a near miss of a car accident, because it was the anxiety of having to unravel things. And it was not because the people on the company side were evil doers. They just hadn't thought it through. And so it wasn't that complicated once you solve the problem to figure out how to make it the experience much more human. It was like, put this, cord here, and the typeface didn't have to be so small. And there's a lot of these considerations that are just thinking, in a human-centric way. But we're seeing that every day now, and I think that's the biggest bang for the buck where we are right now in marketing.
Yeah, I love it. Speaking of marketing, there's a lot of talk about, hey, we got to be data-driven, and at a very high level, yeah, of course. Data can help us make decisions, shape what we're doing. But when you talk about like data-driven marketing, and I heard this in a couple of interviews you did with others, is I love the way that you're thinking about it and emphasizing it. Could you unpack for us a little bit? Because it may feel like just overwhelming, like, oh man, I don't know anything about data. What does that mean for how I run my company or work in our department? Talk to us a little bit about when you talk about data-driven marketing, what are you referring to?
It's one of those things that's become such a throwaway phrase. It means a lot of things to a lot of people, but I think when you get down to the essence of it, it means not guessing. It means looking at the actual hard data of what people are saying, what they're buying, when they're buying it, how they're reacting, but being able to take that information and then put it into a story that makes sense to the people that need to have reactions. So data is just data. Everybody has it. It's not anything that's special.
Right.
Where it becomes valuable is when somebody can translate that into an actual insight that can help you make a better decision. And I think that's where things get lost. Just having more data means absolutely nothing. That everybody has access to data. Sure. And I think where it becomes incredibly valuable is, again, this is the theme, is coming back to the story that you're telling about what does this mean for my business? That's where people get tripped up. And so it's being able to put it into context. It's being able to understand what it means for your business. Like I remember years ago, this is such an old anecdote, but it always stuck with me. Grubhub, it was when this anecdote came out, it was like a really big deal. It might be 7 or 8 years ago already. Their CMO at the time, this was years ago, said they were looking at the analysis of their user behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
And they noticed that when it was going to be rainy, they saw a higher purchase incident of people buying Chinese food or ordering in Chinese food. So they got really smart and they issued coupons. They looked at the weather. They issued coupons in advance of bad weather, and they saw their sales increase.
It's amazing.
Okay, so that's data-driven marketing. That's looking at behaviors and understanding the correlation in a simple way and testing and seeing if they could drive a different behavior or enhance a behavior that was already going in a direction by incentivizing someone to do something in a way that you could anticipate. And I think that's a very simplistic approach. But I think that's where people get confused because they make it so overwhelming and they make it so big.
Right.
And at the end of the day, it goes back to basics. You have to know who your audience is. You have to know what your consumers want, and you have to see what else is out there and being able to use data to make decisions if something worked or something didn't work. That's, everybody has a limited budget to market, to connect with consumers, to make an impact. So you have to figure out, how can I try to anticipate where I'm going to have the most bang for my buck? And that's really, at the end of the day, that's the core of what all of this means. I try to keep things super simple. You need first-party data. I mean, I think what we are seeing, and this is the hard part, is for a lot of companies, they don't have access to first-party data.
Right.
They have access to a lot of other sources of data, but really being able to know who the audience is on a one-to-one basis, that's where you can, the difference between the haves and the have-nots comes in. And getting first-party data is more complicated for some businesses than others. Like, we're seeing it in publishing right now. Publishing, for example, especially with firewalls, publishers have an enormous amount of information about what people are reading, and I'm talking about premium publishers. We know how much time people are spending on their site, where
Absolutely,
they're going.
yeah.
And that's gold. And as difficult as it's getting and the market right now is really challenging for publishers, having that deep understanding of your audience is what brands are looking for, especially brands that don't have access to that. And that's why, it's nothing new, but that's why you've seen over the last 5 years or so these giant acquisitions by companies so that they can get closer to first-party data.
That's good. Like, I could totally imagine a publisher, if they can track the data effectively, I'm pretty sure they could, whether it's using AI or other means of machine learning, of knowing like what type of content is resonating, for how long, what type of chapters work, length, word choice. I mean, I would almost think they could create some books that really connect well with their audience.
Well, I hadn't even thought about it from the book world. I was thinking of just an online publisher, just, any kind of a content site. But gosh, I think they've tried to do that with movies, and I know with AI, they've gotten pretty close with script writing about what works in certain characteristics. But you're the expert on innovation. There's always that aspect of creativity that no machine, thank God, can replace. You can't speak to that on AI yet, thank God. So there's a job for the rest of us.
Yeah. Well, I love it because you when you were at Wonderman, I know one of the things that you were able to do is you had this unique opportunity of working with data scientists as well as creatives. And I always think, like, if you can have those two worlds working together, it's really a powerful mix. I know people may separate those two worlds sometimes, but moving forward, I'm sure we're going to need data and creativity working side by side. Tell us some of your thoughts around these two worlds coming together and what that may mean for business.
Well, I think you're already seeing them come together. And I think part of where the evolution has been is that people were trained, especially in the ad agency world, which has undergone such significant changes, that they were trained to be, you're a creative and you're a data scientist, and you might interact at certain intersections of time, but now everyone has to be able to be fluent in both. And that's what you're seeing in this new crop of creative thinkers, is that it's much more integrated. Where I think you're seeing a lot of incredible use of data and incredible use of creativity is my latest obsession, which is in the world of gaming. And I think which is a good precursor and a good insight of where a lot of this information is coming together, and where they know their audience, and they're pivoting really quickly, and they're developing products that really speak to what's happening in the world right now. And I didn't mean to take you off track, but when I think of the idea of data and creativity, where else can you see it but in this great, exciting laboratory of gaming? And I like to look at it as it's a 3D landscape where you can pretty much do anything you want. And you're seeing a lot of companies do that, especially now where everyone has increased their screen time and we're living in the metaverse to some degree. And so I think that's one of the most exciting places to see innovation.
Yeah, I totally agree. I remember reading about gaming. This must have been 6 years ago. And the number at that point was over 1 billion data points, where they were creating strategy for game scenarios and environments and things, not by guessing about what people would like, but specifically knowing what people do like, and how much is, enough incentives for them to keep playing versus not making it too difficult so they give up. I mean, all of those kind of pulls and pushes on the consumer was all strategically mined and then interpreted and turned into strategy. I like the fact that you brought up gaming, because I know, one of the areas I definitely want to talk to you about is early on when you talk about any type of technology. I know you work with Microsoft, producing some of the original content and delivering revenue from brands that had never previously, purchased digital advertising. You also worked on Expedia's team that successfully executed an IPO from Microsoft to become an independent public company. You've done work with CAA and created a consulting and research practice with expertise on millennials and Gen Z consumers. All of these activities, you seem to kind of, how should I say this, float on the emerging or the frontier of some of these technological conversations. When you think about this, one, is it part your own makeup that naturally you gravitate towards this? Or what's running through your head that you find yourself in these moments? Were they just kind of career opportunities that came up, or did you seek it? I'd love to kind of hear some of your personal side of choosing projects and then going after the things that you're passionate about.
Well, my family would say I'm just crazy, but I think I always like to go where the action is. And early on, when you talk about MSN, I actually worked for Prodigy, for those in the audience that are old enough to remember what that was. And in those days, that was 14.4 dial-up. So it was, remember, I was able to give people 30 hours for free. That was my my big calling card. And then we went to the internet. But I think the common thread was that consumers were always ahead of brands. And I found that fascinating, because there was a huge gap between what was happening on the tech side and what was happening on the marketing and brand side. And I loved being in between. And so when I went to Microsoft in those days, they were still, MSN was brand new, and we were still using the channel idea. It was and now it would probably work again, but they had channels. MSN was, it was still building off the TV mentality. And it was really an interesting time to be at Microsoft in those days, because it was not they were not known for content at that stage. And so it really attracted people that were curious. Same thing when we went to Expedia, and Expedia went from a CD-ROM. Yes, there was a CD-ROM version of Expedia.
That's right. I completely forgot about that.
remember it? Richard Bangs had a travel show, and you'd get it on a CD-ROM.
Oh my goodness.
And then, right, Rich Barton though had this brilliant idea. But wait a second, it could be better. Travel could be better if you actually could facilitate the booking.
Right.
So he built Expedia, and that just the curiosity and the connection. It was really early days. There are a lot of things that we take for granted now. Were big challenges then. I had to have a tech partner assigned to me because the technology was so complicated. I mean, we were still in the browser wars back then. So it was really, I was a diver in high school, and not a very good one. So I say it's like my jobs have always been like climbing up to the high diving board and just, taking a shot, hitting my head against the board and going after it again and again. And so it's really about being in a place where people are treading, breaking new ground and trying things that had never been done before. And I think just as like my crazy streak has always attracted me to that sort of ability and the opportunity to create new and to do things that people hadn't done before, but to add value. And I think they all kind of built on each other. I did not have a grand plan. I really didn't. And I got very lucky.
No, I think I know we're not on this particular like career advancement or career growth type of topic thread, but man, that's really good advice. Like not shying away from opportunities that give you to be in the action, even if it's unclear or uncertain what the outcomes might be. I think that's a great way of looking at professional development, career growth, advancement, those kinds of things. So I'm so glad you did that. I want to go back to your thought a little bit on personalization. I know that, I think you've mentioned before that digital is not just a mechanism of delivery. And we are starting to see this definitely in the retail space. I know there are a lot of trends that are emerging, whether it's like, having a tailor at a clothing store available to customize it, or software technology that can like help body map you, so you can almost have your avatar go into stores and try out clothing and such and see what it may look like. Help us see, because as people, leading companies, thinking about the customer, trying to be, take on things like design thinking and human-centric design, personalization, are there like key things you think about when it comes to personalization? Or do those independently just arise as you pay attention to the person, I guess?
Well, from the perspective of the company, if you're obviously you're in retail, that means being able to understand what product assortment is more valuable to one consumer versus another, versus if you're selling a car. Personalization means, what kind of a customer service plan makes the most sense for this person versus this person. And I think it's about the expectation, because right now people they vote with their purchases. And we used to use a phrase back when I was at CIA, and I still think it's really valuable. It's this idea that people are venture consumers, just like venture capitalists, and they're voting with their purchases. And the idea is that if I'm going to spend my money on your brand, I'm going to do a lot of research, and I want to feel as if you are as invested in me as I am in you, because otherwise I'll take my business and go somewhere else. And, beyond what Amazon has been able to get us all accustomed to, it's really the idea of, I want to know that I'm getting value. I want to know that you care about my business. I want to know that you are interested in how my needs are evolving and where I am in my customer journey.
Right.
And that's pretty critical, because we've all had those bad experiences of a brand not knowing that we've just bought something and they're sending us an email saying buy this product and we just bought it, and those kind of things. And that gets back into, quote unquote digital marketing, is that being able to have a unified view of your consumer journey is really where this all comes down to. So if I'm shopping on mobile, and I'm in the old days, I'd go into the store versus going on your .com. It's important for the brand to be able to know that that's me, And
Yep.
that's a very complicated thing to get done, but that's the expectation of consumers, because
Right.
they want to know that you care and that you're paying attention and that you're going to earn their trust and loyalty by making that investment in them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I had a experience recently with customer service from one of the major banks, and the customer service rep kept reading off,
Yeah.
their guideline or their protocol on what I ought to do, and it became a little bit frustrating. I mean, it was very frustrating actually, where they kept leading me to someone else that led me to someone else that led me back to the original person I started with. And I'm like, you guys aren't solving my problem. And so, yeah, I think understanding that and approaching from that perspective is very helpful. Now, I know we don't have too
Well,
much. Yeah, go ahead.
I would just say a great example of AI and customer service and digital. I will share this example. T-Mobile early on recognized the value of customer service, and one of the things they did pretty early was they connected their in-store with their customer helpline, so that if you called an operator, and this seemed really revolutionary a few years ago when they did this, but
Hmm.
um, if you called the customer service center, they not only knew who you were, but they were able to give the operator a script and be able to pull up all of your records and connect them to you as the same consumer that walked into a T-Mobile store. And making those connections and making it seamless really, as you can see, that brand
Yeah,
and that company has obviously skyrocketed. But it's those kind of things that make a big impact, because
yeah,
you're obviously being kind and you're not telling us which bank it is, but you're obviously not pleased. So you're not going to say anything nice about that bank. Whereas
right.
if you have a great experience, it's obviously going to have so much more impact to be able to be an advocate for that brand. But I think
Absolutely.
we've talked a little bit too about younger consumers, and I love to bring that up right now,
Yeah,
because here we are talking about older, us as grown-ups and having been through the wars of business, and now you have these younger consumers where it's table stakes. All of this stuff is table stakes for them.
mm,
And Gen Z in particular are such a conundrum for brands, and they have been, because they don't operate. They're very different than millennials, and to some degree, talking about people as you know millions of people as a generation, there's a lot of individual
totally,
differences.
totally. Yeah,
But what you can see is pretty much, you can say anybody under the age of 30 has grown up with technology. They don't think about it, and their expectations for what works is so much higher than
mm,
the rest of us. And so whether you call them millennials, whether you're talking about millennials or Gen Z or Gen Alpha or anybody else, if
yeah.
you say anyone under the age of 30 has a higher expectation, those are the consumers that you're really going to have to adapt to serve, that many companies are not in a position to do that right now.
Yeah, totally. And I'd love to dive into that because I don't want to get off this call without getting some of your specific thoughts on quote unquote Gen Z, which, like you mentioned, it could be anywhere under 30, but more like specific range, probably under 24. It kind of depends who you're talking to. And the reality is by 2026, I remember reading that it's estimated that Gen Z will make up the largest consumer population, as well as this will probably be the most ethnically diverse and largest generation in US history. And I think those have implications on how you think about your customer. Talk to us a little bit as you've worked in this space and have done lots of, research around traits and trends and what's working, what's not. What are some things worth noting about this younger generation, like our kids, and how they're consuming? Like I'm constantly asking our kids, like, "Hey, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? Have you tried? Why do you like that particular app versus another? Why do you shop this way?" And it's different between my 17-year-old and my 13-year-old. So talk to us a little bit about this generation.
We're all seeing that up close and personal in ways that we never before imagined that right
Yeah,
now. I mean,
yeah,
that's the great social experiment, is multiple generations living at home together
yeah.
and seeing their behaviors. It's like a constant laboratory. That has been incredibly fascinating. And also younger, the kids at home are the tech support that we're used to getting in our office. And that makes for quite a few interesting dynamics. But
Yeah.
just kind of zooming out for a second, Gen Z typically are the children of Gen X. So if you look at it, boomers, then Gen X, then millennials, Gen Y, the interchangeable name, and then Gen Z, right? So boomers are the parents of millennials, and Gen X are the parents of Gen Z. And Gen Z is 26 and younger, probably till about, they say generations are 20 years. So it's very fluid, but they're about somewhere at the older age, like late 20s on down. So Gen X, that was the generation of, disaffected, latchkey kids. I always say Gen X's are raised by wolves. And we didn't, that was a generation that didn't have play dates or sunblock or any of that stuff. It's like, you'd rather live on the streets than move home with mom and dad.
Yep.
And now everybody's living at home together. So that's a nightmare for Gen X. But for Gen Z, they grew up much more independent. The difference with millennials, when they were growing up, there was this huge boom of kids, and the fear was that they weren't going to be able to get jobs or get into college because there were so many of them. So it had a bit of a different dynamic with how they're being raised, and Gen X raised Gen Z to be more resilient because it was a significantly scarier time. Now it's scary for everybody. Right. So Gen Z, just by and large, tends to be a bit more individualistic and independent than other generations. One of the things that I am talking a lot about with Gen Z that I think is super interesting, and you're seeing it on TikTok as an example, is that Gen Z is rewarded for their individuality in a way that wasn't possible or just didn't work before. So for example, on TikTok, you don't know what the algorithm is going to pick up on and going to highlight as being popular. Right. So it's kind of an interesting driver to encourage kids to be their unique selves, because the algorithm is picking up on things that stick out and characteristics or talent that there is no formula for. Right. And I think that's, a little bit of a microcosm, but you're seeing this generations being rewarded for being individualistic and independent. But they're also, and we're seeing this every day, they're the ones that, if you want to see where the future's going, look at Gen Z. Watch what they're doing. So if you imagine they've grown up, playing games and having their version of sophisticated digital experiences, and then you look at how, you fast forward and they're the consumer that's buying insurance or buying a car or dealing with a bank, to your example, those experiences have not come anywhere close to catching up with what they're used to in terms of smooth, friction-free experiences. And again, that delta is an opportunity. That gap is where there's a lot of upside to transform, to think of the human experience. All the things that we started in this conversation, I think, is where you really start to see the upside and transforming how a company does business. And that's what we're all living right now, day to day. So I'm actually really quite optimistic about those things, but it can be really scary for some of the legacy companies that, that are out there. One other really interesting example, I'm going to sound like one of these old people, but there's an influencer. There's a guy named David Dobrik who's a really successful influencer. He's on Instagram and on TikTok and everything else. He has, if you want to see a formula for brands integrating in content that appeals to a younger audience, he's got to deal with SeatGeek, and this is one of my favorite examples. And SeatGeek obviously is a site where you buy tickets when we had events. But they have integrated with David Dobrik to his millions of fans, so that actually when SeatGeek is part of the content, people get excited about it. They don't view it as a commercial. They don't view it as an interruption. They view it as an additive, making the content even better. So, for example, SeatGeek paid the college tuition for one of his friends, or they bought him they took all of his friends to the World Series. They do things that add to the experience, and so they're not viewed as an advertiser. They're viewed as a partner. And I just love that example.
Yeah. I mean, like you mentioned, like for any of these moments where I feel like whenever brands feel like they are becoming potentially antiquated or stuck, these are really opportunities for them. And definitely on the digital front of like it being integrated everything, we're seeing the emergence of, mixed realities that may include everything from VR to AR to AI, all these letters that impact gaming, virtual communities. When I think about these things, what are you finding from like Gen Z as it relates to how they sense community and what that means for the brands that they potentially consume?
I love that question. Well, here's again, I go back to it's like an anthropological answer. Human beings, especially of that age, are hardwired in our DNA to connect with other people.
Yep.
So there's no mystery. Any brand or organization or service that enables that connection, whether it's gaming or communications or whatever it might be right now, those are the brands that are going to win because human beings want to be connected to other human beings. And so it could be in a virtual setting, it could be in the metaverse, it could be through a chat application, Zoom, whatever these ways that are enabling human connection may be. Gen Z, all human beings are trying to stay connected. So the people that can help and the brands that can help them do that and more efficiently and more effectively are the ones that are really going to bubble up and succeed. And I think that's a lesson that we used to say at Microsoft back in the dark days, just because you can doesn't mean you should. So just because an engineer can put an extra button on there or, you can make it go to 11 in the old Spinal Tap language, doesn't mean you should. But what is important is, does it really enhance the human experience? And that's the sort of the true north that I think people need to look for. It's not just adding more digital components to it because you can. But I think we're entering into the stage where, Amazon is getting ready to launch their new metaverse, the Crucible. That's their version of Fortnite. Obviously, you have Fortnite and Epic Games killing it.
Yep.
These are 3D canvases where they're social networks, they're e-commerce platforms, they're live event experiences. They're where people are meeting each other. They're having lifelong experiences. That's not going away. And I think the numbers are just, Roblox in March, they saw a 40% increase in users just in March. I think it's probably, even bigger. They had a $4 billion valuation in February, and that's a company that's been around for 15 years already. So you're seeing these audiences really drive value and build stickiness because it's serving a need. It's serving a fundamental human need.
Yeah, I am so fascinated because I feel like, when you talk about, say, being very individualistic and unique and at the same time so deeply committed into community and kind of going back and forth. And, initially when I used to observe that type of thinking on both sides, I would think, man, that feels like a contradiction. But in actuality, the more I try to, I guess at some level, empathize, and try to understand even the way that my daughter, my 13-year-old thinks. Like at one point, she wants to be incredibly individualistic so that if she's on something like TikTok and she feels like it's just consuming her life, she'll literally delete it for a month. And I'm like, wow, that's impressive. But at the same time, she is definitely mindful of the images that certain influencers and others project. So it's kind of an interesting balance of both and rather than either or. And so there's definitely a lot to think about as this kind of generation leads us in so many different areas of life.
Well, where they're really leading us, I think, and we didn't talk about this, but is the issue of privacy and safety and how that translates to everybody. I mean, we look at, TikTok just got fined again. And so I work with a company called SuperAwesome, and their mission is making the internet safer for kids. And they're, really focused on finding the safe ways to help marketers be able to connect directly with kids, but in a COPA compliant, GDPR compliant way.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important, not because it's good business, and it is good business. It's important because it's the right thing to do.
Right.
But a lot of adults, when I talk to them about what we're doing, say, well, why can't we have that? Why can't we as adult consumers have that same level of privacy?
Yeah.
And that's a big issue. And I think we're seeing that broadly out in the world right now, is this consternation of we're also connected. So what's the balance of giving up our individual privacy and liberty for the greater good? And where's the line drawn? I think that, like many people are talking about it that are much more knowledgeable than I am about this, but I think that's going to be one of the big fundamental questions as we go through the next few years. And where our kids are right now, as your 13-year-old is a much more informed consumer than 25-year-olds were. We knew nothing. You just gave over all of your information. So
yeah.
At least we're learning it's, pre and post Snowden world that we're living in. And at least we have the benefit of hindsight. I mean, I will never forget, kind of tying back to when you brought up Facebook, in the beginning, people were sharing, I mean, they still do, but they were sharing an enormous amount of information about their kids. And then their kids got to that stage where their parents had created a digital dossier of their kids without their consent.
Right.
And then kids got to that age where other kids were looking up their friends on Google and on Facebook, et cetera. And they saw all of this content about them available publicly that they had not given permission for.
Right.
So we just didn't know. Now we know. So what are we doing about it? And that's really going to be an interesting and really important thing for brands to think about, is how are you treating the data and privacy? It's important to have it so that you are providing a really good, customized, individualistic experience, and yet you have to be incredibly diligent with how you're taking care of that data and what are the fine lines with permission and what's creepy and what's relevant. I mean, those are some massively important questions that, we all have a lot of work to do to consider.
This is so good. I know we could talk for hours on this, and I know we're running out of time. So I'm going to ask you this one last question, because you're definitely one of the most interesting people that I've met, in the sense of you're keeping your eyes and ears wide open to kind of observe what's happening. And I think that's an incredible trait. So right now, maybe I can leave you with this question: is what are you most passionate about these days? And who or what are you most inspired by right now?
Oh, wow. That's a really big question. Well, I've been talking about it. I'm obsessed with games and gamers, and really the impact that this metaverse is having on the rest of the world, for good or for bad. I mean, it's as an ability, as an environment to raise money, as an environment that can make humans more connected and feel like they have relationships across geographies and gender and age. I think gamers are going to, they're our best chance at saving the world. I know that sounds hokey, and I'm a Gen X, so I don't say hokey. I don't do hokey very well.
Yeah.
But I'm really optimistic and bullish on gamers, and I think watching what they're doing and how they're evolving and really pushing the boundaries of what's possible with connection and play and community, that's a place to watch and be inspired. And whether it's high fashion and Gucci tapping into them and Riot Games, or the Red Cross doing fundraising on Fortnite. It's such a broad environment and such a hopeful environment that, to me, that's the place to pay attention to.
I love it. Well, keep doing what you're doing, Jamie. I've always respected your work. Thanks for so many great insights and illustration. And I think a lot of our listeners have benefited of just thinking about these things. And now I have 10 more things to think about. So thanks for that as well.
Well, thank you for having me. I always, I'm a huge fan of yours, and I have your book, Good Idea, Now What, sitting right here on my desk, and I refer to it often. So Not always, it's not just important to have the good ideas, it's important to be able to execute. And boy, do you execute well. So thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk to your audience.
Well, thank you. And thanks everyone for listening in to another episode of the Ideation Podcast.